Hey everybody, today's video is called Approach God with Care, and tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of Ecclesiastes, where we're looking at the 5th chapter, and we're going to be looking at reverent worship as the focus of the preacher and author. So what is reverent worship? Is reverent worship turning Bibles wrapped in a material looking like a football and kicking it across the sermon stage? Is reverent worship something that we seek to feel good about in worship, maybe almost like a sappy love song? So tonight we're going to look at Ecclesiastes 5, and we're going to talk about worship and what it means in reverent worship. So Ecclesiastes 5 verse 1 through 3 says, "Walk prudently when you go to the house of God, and draw near to hear, rather than to give the sacrifices of fools, for they do not know that they do evil. Do not be rash with your mouth, and let not your heart utter anything hastily before God. For God is in heaven, and you on earth. Therefore let your words be few. For a dream comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words." So when we see in verse 1, the house of God, when you go to the house of God here is referring to the temple that Solomon built in Jerusalem in 1 Kings chapter 8 verse 15 through 21. And because God is in heaven and man is on earth, rash promises and arguments before him are foolish. And sacrifice of fools is in verse 1 is hasty speech, as Solomon counsels to come to the house of God to hear more than to speak without thinking. And Solomon, he's rightly describing human tendency to speak without thinking before God and others. And as men, we are pretty good at that, speaking before thinking. But in 1 Kings 18, the priests of Baal prayed hard and long at Mount Carmel, while Elijah prayed short and sweet and full of faith to the living God. And we see in 1 Kings 18 that God heard and beautifully answered Elijah's prayer, though it being smaller than the Babylon prayers. And in verse 4 through 7, it says, "When you make a vow to God, do not delay it to pay it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. Don't let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God that it was an error. Why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? For the multitude of dreams and many words there is also vanity, but fear God." So we see an introduction to the books here, concluding guidance to approach God with reverence. In verses 4 to 5, made to God have serious implications. In the Old Testament, background for this guidance is found back in Deuteronomy 23 verse 21 through 23 and Judges 11:35. And Ananias and Sapphira learned the hard way, and we're going to look at that passage in our wrap up. And what we got to understand as part of reverent worship, having a healthy fear of God, is don't vow something that your fleshly desire will cause you to break. You are better off not making any promises. And the priest in the house of God is the messenger, as in Malachi chapter 2 verse 7. And both the priests and the prophets are called messengers and commissaries who deliver and report back messages for the heavenly king, as in Isaiah chapter 6. And don't tell them your broken vow was a small thing. The preacher in verse 7 sets forth the basis for the conclusion of the book, as we are called to fear God and to keep his commandments. And when we get to chapter 12 verse 13, that is what is in chapter 12 verse 13. And one thing, as I've said already, and I really want you to dwell on this, is God doesn't take broken vows lightly and may incur judgment upon our endeavors. And it's a sin commonly overlooked by among God's people, as we promise God, hey, I'm going to do this, God, at this time. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. Lord, give me this so I'll do that then. All that type of stuff. And then we don't live up to it. And if we want to honor God, we should not be quick to make vows to him. We need to be serious when we make a vow to fulfill it, and when we have made it. And when we break our vows, we need to treat them as sins. We need to confess them and repent of them. In verse 8 and 9, it says, if you see the oppression of the poor and the violent perversion of justice and righteousness in a province, do not marvel at the matter, for the high official watches over high official, and higher officials are over them. Moreover, the profit of the land is for all. Even the king is served from the field. So officials have an unfair advantage to attain wealth. And these verses return to, and it's expanding back in our last chapter on the topic of oppression and injustice from chapter 3, verse 16-17. And oppression and injustice from the layers of government and a society are unavoidable. And we see that among us right now. We see injustice all around the United States. We see oppression taking place as well. And even in a complex and often corrupt bureaucracy, everyone depends on what comes from the farmer's field, including the king. The king, who is the top of the land, depends on the farmer for food supply back at this time. And the preachers seem to delight in these ironies of life. And when I look at a passage like that in verse 9, moreover, the profit of the land is for all, even the king is served from the field. We should remember, no matter what our occupation is, what our job is, we should never look down on someone who does something that we might think is a low type job. We never should look down on someone for what they do for a living. And that is why we must be kind, as we often depend on them somehow. For example, a janitor. We depend on janitors to keep, places clean and up to work. And they should not be looked at as, a high school dropout or whatever the case might be. I mean, we're moving in a society where outside of fast food, even some fast food places are requiring college degrees. But to me, a janitor should receive the same respect as the CEO of the company, and vice versa. The CEO should show respect to the janitor just like he would show respect to those, under him, like the chief president or whatever, treasurer, whatever, other executive positions are working with him. In verse 10 through 12, it says, he who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. This is also vanity. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. So what profit have the owners except to see them with their own eyes? The sleep of the laboring man is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep. So verse 10, the love of money is never satisfied. And we'll talk more about that in our wrap up. In verse 11, it says, that they increase to eat. And that refers to the rich man's dependence. And from here through our next chapter, we're going to get an extended teaching on wealth that the preacher uses to close his search for the escape of vanity of life. And the preacher's search began with vanity in chapter 1, verse 14, and ends now with vanity. And the preacher contrasts the love of money, it should be, with the contentment of honest labor. In verse 13 through 17, it says, there is a severe evil which I have seen under the sun. Riches kept for the owner to his hurt, but those riches perish through misfortune. When he begets a son, there is nothing in his hand. As he came from his mother's womb, naked shall he return. To go as he came, and he shall take nothing from his labor, which he may carry away in his hand. And this also is a severe evil, just exactly as he came, so shall he go. And what profit has he who has labored for the wind? All his days he also eats in darkness, and has much sorrow, sickness, and anger. So earthly treasures precarious and bring disadvantages. They bring and produce anxiety, pain, and they disappear through bad business and left at death. Our earthly treasures, our earthly materials, we aren't going to bring them with us into eternity. And they can even produce fear. And the preacher ponders the tragedies of unused and lost wealth. And whatever isn't lost in bad venture must be left behind at death. And apart from an eternal perspective, earthly labor appears to be in vain. And in verse 15, it's similar to Job 121, as Job said in his suffering, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return." And with a sympathetic touch, Solomon tells us that loneliness, sorrow, and anger, there is even for the very wealthy. In verse 18 through 20, it says, "Here is what I have seen. It is good and fitting for one to eat and drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor in which he toils under the sun all the days of his life, which God gives him. For it is his inheritance. As for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, and given them power to eat of it, to receive his heritage and rejoice in his labor. This is the gift of God. For he will not dwell unduly on the days of his life, because God keeps him busy with the joy of his heart." So we see chapter 5 wraps up into verse 20 right here. And in verse 18, the word "fit in" is the same word from chapter 3, verse 11, meaning beautiful. And once again, Solomon uses a warning to enjoy the richness of life that God gives. And to understand that God gave us the gift is to enjoy the satisfaction of the good gifts. And when we recognize the goodness of God, when a person recognizes the goodness of God, he rejoices and does not dwell unduly on the troubles detailed in the previous content. And as we're going to see through the next chapter, we're going to see the sovereignty of God as he distributes wealth and the ability to enjoy it. And God intends that people should enjoy the benefits of their work as a due reward of their labor. So God is a capitalist, I believe. And the ability to enjoy earthly labor comes not from stoic human strength, but God-given grace granted to rich and poor alike. And though the preacher knew that riches didn't bring true meaning to life, he was no fool. He understood it was better to have wealth than to not have it at all. And under the sun, one should enjoy both wealth and the capacity to enjoy it as a gift of God. And Solomon's counsel to the wealthy man who finds no ultimate meaning under the sun, try not to think about it and keep yourself busy, is his saying. So to wrap up today's video, we see the preacher call for worshiping God reverently, to fear God and to obey his commandments. And he says, come to the house of God to hear and obey, rather than to come and speak. And the thoughts of the heart are expressed in the words of the mouth, which God will judge them. We see in Matthew chapter 12, verse 34. Matthew 12:34, brood of vipers, how can you be an evil speak good things? For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. A good man out of good treasure of his heart will bring forth good things, and an evil man out of the evil treasures bring forth evil things. But I say to you that every idle word men may speak, they will give account for it on judgment day. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. So, in verses 4 through 7, Solomon says, keep your vows and fear God. And then when you go over to Acts chapter 5, we talked about these people. Acts chapter 5, verse 1 through 11 says, but a certain man named Ananias, and with Sapphira, his wife, sold a possession. And then he kept back part of the proceeds, his wife also being aware of it, and brought a certain part and laid it at the apostles' feet. But Peter said, Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and to keep back part of the price of the land for yourself? While it has remained, was it not your own? And after it was sold, was it not in your own control? Why have you conceived this thing in your heart? You have not lied to men, but to God. Then Ananias, hearing these words, fell down and breathed his last. So great fear came upon all those who heard these things. And the young man arose and wrapped himself up, carried him out, and buried him. Now it was about the 3 hours later when his wife came in, not knowing what had happened. And Peter answered her, tell me whether you sold the land for so much. She said, yes, for so much. Then Peter said to her, how is it that you have agreed together to test the Spirit of the Lord? Look, the feet of those who have buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out. Then immediately she fell down at his feet and breathed her last. And the young men came in and found her dead, carrying her out and buried her by her husband. So great fear came upon all the church and upon all who heard these things. So Ananias and Sapphira learned the hard way, as we see here, that integrity is meaning with God. In Solomon, in verses 8 through 9, we see the enduring fact of oppression and injustice he dwells back on. In verse 10 through 12 shows the dissatisfaction in the accumulation of wealth. And I want to go over to 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 6. It says, now godliness with contentment is great gain, for we have brought nothing in this world, and it is certain we carry nothing out. And having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness and pierced themselves through many sorrows. So Timothy here speaks of we need to be content whether, if we don't have more than what we want. We need to be content with what we have. We need to be content that God provides for our needs with our food and clothing and such. And people who seek money and who are greedy, they fall into a whole different issue. So we must choose contentment over greed. And Solomon in verse 13 through 17 shows the uncertainty of wealth. And what we must understand is that wealth can and does disappear. And our wealth, our possessions here on earth, we're going to lose it upon our death. We will not be able to bring a U-Haul with us with our possessions behind the hearse. And we must, as the New Testament calls to lay up treasure in heaven in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6, our focus should be on investing into the kingdom. And you cannot take your wealth with you when you die, but you can send it on ahead by generous giving to God's work. And we see that the chapter ends with making the best of a bad situation under the sun. And that's going to wrap up today's video. We'll see you next as we look at what cannot satisfy as we continue through Ecclesiastes, and I'll let you know when that will be. I hope you have a great rest of your evening. God bless.